As the discussion continued amongst the heads of Jurassic Safari Park on what dinosaurs will be put in the final 2 pens, the next big attraction that will be added to an existing zone was in progress. It was another hybrid, and listed once more from Site 10, Location E. The Stegoceratops was, as its name implied, a mixture between a Stegosaurus and a Triceratops. There was a heavy discussion on which of the two was the more dominant on display. The body was that of a Triceratops, but it looked heavily modified. Not only did it have the Stegosaurus plating all over its body, including the tail spikes, but the blades could even be found on its head, as were its horns abnormally large. They were so large, in fact, that some argued that they were too heavy for the creature. In the long run, it might even result in some health issues, as keeping the head adjusted with that added weight would become a more difficult task over time. 2 Stegoceratops were being brought over, both in a different color pattern. The Stegosaurus-like blades on its back were the brightest of color and difficult to miss. They were tranquilized and brought over to the mixed pen of Stegosaurus and Triceratops. In terms of its personality, there were some questions being asked. The Stegosaurus was a sluggish dinosaur that kept calm most of the time. This was on display again, as none of them seemed to mind the incoming helicopters, whereas the Triceratops ran around in a bit of a frantic panic. Personality-wise, it seemed to be a bit of a mix as well. The 2 new hybrids could be spotted running around the first couple of minutes, as they did not understand what was going on. But as soon as they had something to drink or eat, they would calm down and be as friendly as their fellow neighborhood Stegosaurus. Even the other Triceratops, who were a little bit more antsy than the Stegos, eventually warmed up to them, not being afraid of eating around them at the same time. The difference in horn size also did not seem to intimidate them. The Stegoceratops, in a way, was very well protected. It could lash out at its enemy with the horns on its head, but even also deal damage with its tail. This was something not many dinosaurs could. Despite the Stegoceratops making a relatively calm impression, the moment that the Rangers headed in there, the sound of the engine did seem to startle them a little bit. Obviously, the other dinosaurs did not seem to care, as they were used to them by now. The Rangers stayed a little bit longer and tried not to make too much noise, and eventually, the hybrids did grow accustomed to the presence of humans in their vicinity. And all the while, the friendly Triceratops grazed on. Then it was time to look towards the next zone. Plans were already underway, as they were previously interrupted by the announcement of the Stegoceratops. This next zone would be a fairly small one, and thus it would be perfect for some smaller herbivores. The Dracorex was first chosen to be added here, though there were those who were worried that they were so small that they would blend in too much with the tall grass. But first things first, they would be added to see how the size was. 3 Dracorex were first flown over, and these small critters were not particularly difficult dinosaurs personality-wise. They were very keen on being with their fellow species though, and since that demand was met, they easily accepted their new home. So then it was time to decide on what dinosaurs it would share its pen with. There had already been suggestions by fellow head scientists to add similar types like the Pachycephalosaurus or the Stygimolog. The Pachys were, unlike the Dracorex, a bit more agitated, and everyone agreed that 2 would be enough as to not encourage them to be the dominant species within the zone. But at least they were a lot bigger, meaning they were easier to spot for any guests that entered here. The visitors were also asked not to get too close to any of the Pachys, as their ramming power could dent a car quite easily. But for now, everything seemed fine, as the Dracorex and the Pachycephalosaurus lived in harmony. Then lastly, there was one more type of dinosaurs to complete the set. The Stygimoloch was almost as a mix of the Dracorex and the Pachy by itself. It had the spikes of a Dracorex, albeit a lot bigger, and it had the same bulge on its head that it would use in the same sense as a Pachycephalosaurus. These two were fairly easily agitated. Part of this came through the constant battles males would have over dominance. More so than other species did they have duels to decide a leader for the pack. 3 were chosen to be sent over to the zone. They were bigger than a Dracorex, but smaller than the Pachy. They did blend into the tall grass as well, with their tall spikes popping out. Their color scheme was a little brighter, making them a fan favorite amongst visitors. The initial run made by the rangers did pose some interesting scenarios. Some of the small dinosaurs could be seen crossing the road, making for nice and unique opportunities. But as feared, they were indeed difficult to spot once in the grass. The route itself though was fun to drive, as a few curves here and there made it more interesting for the one behind the wheel. Despite not being the largest animal, the Stygimoloch was the one that had the easiest photo opportunity. Then all of a sudden, another ranger had a new idea regarding some of the docile predators. Though it was agreed by everyone that the up-close and personal meetings with predators would attract a lot of guests, they also saw that the carnivores needed to be introduced at a fairly slow pace. The next predator that would be introduced to be amongst the people was the Velociraptor. A smaller kind, and a creature that in the eyes of the rangers was perfect to be part of the so-called raptor petting zoo. Rather than a zoo, it was a certain period in the day where the docile raptors were put amongst visitors and they could take pictures with it or pet it. The petting initially was created from inspiration formed after some of the scientists had watched a video of some of these dinosaurs from an early age. They seemed almost friendly and allowed humans to touch them. Four raptors were flown over and had been manipulated to be docile. They were lifted in the main street where many customers waited anxiously, but it turned out that the initial T-Rex test was a lot more successful. The raptors, even though docile, made a very scary impression on the guests with their twitching movements and loud screeches. Even though there were no signs of aggressiveness, it did not invite any of the guests to come closer. Some even ran, creating a bit of confusion even for the raptor that had its instincts suppressed. Because the raptor was also a lot smaller, it was easier to lose in the park. Rather than the T-Rex that stayed out in the open, the raptor soon headed towards the nearest bushes for some shade and protection. It was clear that were they to try this experiment again, that some rangers needed to be present to keep them within the selected area. Even once the raptors headed back towards a more crowded area and fall asleep there, no one dared to get close. The rangers promised they were as docile as a puppy, but in the end, no one wanted anything to do with it. There were some overseas who expressed interest in something like this, and the safari park said that maybe in the future they would try something like this again. A dinosaur like a T-Rex is so big that no one can come close for safety reasons. Photo opportunities would be made from a safe distance, though closer than at a regular zoo. But with the raptors, it was a different story, as they were so tiny that one had to get really close to get some nice shots, and no one was willing to do that. And thus the raptors were being sent over towards the other raptors already in the park. Those dinosaurs were not manipulated, and it would be interesting to see if they would be accepted by the pack. With that out of the way, the park headlines quickly tried to move away from the failed raptor experiment. And thus, the next introduction would need to be something that struck awe again in the visitors' eyes. Something big. Something like the mighty Spinosaurus.